to DC grants for businesses generally. This is the second in a 4-part series that the DSLBD Innovation and Equitable Development Division is running in July 2021. Today, we are going to cover how to prepare for grants. We have a lot of content to cover in 1 hour, so we're going to dive right in. We can go to the next slide. Okay. Are we seeing a delay on the slides on my side? There it is. We apologize. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Please do bear with us. But as I just mentioned, this is the second in a 4-part series. Last week, we covered where to find grants, and that is a recorded session that we'll send out to all registrants. And in the rest of July, we will cover grant programs of note, some of the really big business development grants that exist across the district. And on July 28th, we're going to talk about how to make the grants process work for you, because grants are very competitive and they're a lot of work. And so it can be really hard if you do a lot of work for a grant and don't achieve it, but there are other ways that preparing for a grant can be supportive of your business. We'll go to that next slide. So we're going to introduce your speakers today. So I am Kate Marand. I'm the program manager here at the Inno.ED team. I'll let Caroline introduce herself.
Yes, hello, this is Caroline Howe. I'm also a member of the Inno.ED team. I support our returning citizens program, Aspire, and especially our food and green businesses. Great to see you all.
Thank you so much. And you can always reach out to our team at the email address that's on the slide. If you are here by phone, that email address is inno.ed@dc.gov. And we do one-on-one technical assistance. We answer a lot of questions via that email. So feel free to reach out. If we can answer that question, we will. If we can't, we will look for a referral for you in the district. So for today's agenda, we're going to cover just a very brief recap of a couple of things that we discussed last week. A big bulk of what we're going to talk about is the standard paperwork that is required for district government grants. It's a little bit different per every grant program, but there are some things that are required on all grants. And we know where people struggle on those from what we've seen from a lot of people either asking questions or on some of the grants that we offer. So we're going to walk through some of that. Caroline is going to take us through some information about reading and responding to an RFA, and we'll describe what an RFA, but that will be preparation on a specific grant. And then we're going to talk a little bit about additional financing options, because we know everyone needs access to capital. Grants are wonderful when you have access to them and when you are able to be awarded a grant, but we know that there are a lot of access to capital needs beyond that. And so we're going to share just a couple of things that we can do to help support you through DSLBD. So we can go to that next slide. Okay, last week, we walked through a lot of the exact websites where you will find grants and showed you where on the website to find them, but there are a couple of main sources. The agency pages are definitely a main source, but also the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs has a grants portal where most grants from across district government should be notified, as well as the DC Register where grants are legally required to be notified. We covered just a little bit about federal grants, and so sometimes you can find those on the agency pages and also grants.gov. And if you are looking for private grants, and there are many of them, those are all privately marketed, so it can be a little bit harder to find those. But we did share that the DC Women's Business Center does have a great listing of grants for businesses that you might want to keep an eye out on. Some of those are for women businesses only, but some of them are broader as well. We'll go to that next slide. So I think if you want to catch that session, it is available at this link. It's also available at our YouTube. If you're having troubles finding any of those, you can also just email us and we'll make sure that we get that information over to you. And when we're done with the full series, we'll make sure that all 4 of the sessions are available. Go to the next slide. And I think one of the really key takeaways from last week, and I think a lot of folks know this, but we do want to always make sure that we mention this, grants are very competitive. And it can be very heartbreaking to put a lot of work in on a grant and then not receive it. And sometimes that can feel very personal. But one of the things to recognize about grants is that there are usually a lot more applications than there is funding. A lot of people are interested in grant opportunities. And so we want to take this moment to mention that, you might have had a good application and not have been funded. That's not unusual. But one of the things that we're going to really cover today is if you have an error in some of your paperwork, particularly at the eligibility stage, you might have been marked out there. And it's very unlikely that if you have an error in your paperwork that you would even get to be having your grant application scored. And so we want to help people think about what are those pieces so that they can prepare, so that if you do a lot of work on a grant, that your grant application is able to be considered in the process. Let's go to that next slide. So one of the things to remember is that grants are a legal process when they come through district government. And so there are rules and laws that govern the grants process, some at every agency level, some at an individual agency level, and they are really paperwork heavy. And some of the reasons for that paperwork is to make sure that both the agencies are following the rules and laws and to make sure the applicants are as well. And another piece that we'll talk a little bit about later on for why a lot of this paperwork is required is also to make sure that you are the one who's actually receiving the funding if it's your business. So let's talk a little bit about standard paperwork for grants. And it can be a lot, but let's go to that next slide. So some of the basics that are really required for a lot of grants when you apply with district government, you often need to have a federal employee identification number, a DC business license. You need to have something that's called clean hands. You are probably going to be required to have insurance. Maybe a specific type, maybe only general liability, but insurance is typically required. Sometimes it's required upfront, sometimes it's required only if you are awarded the grant. We'll talk about that. Different from clean hands, and we'll talk about that difference, is corporate good standing. Certificate of occupancy may be required, particularly if your grant is about storefront improvements. And you're also probably at the eligibility stage going to have to provide both organizational budget documents and tax filings. And that would be different than a budget that you would submit about the project itself. And so you may actually have to prepare 2 budgets. So we can go ahead and go to that next slide. I have a whole nother slide with more things that might be required for that grant. So sometimes required at applications, sometimes only required once you are awarded. You may need a Dun & Bradstreet registration. You may need an AREBA number. If the grant is for a certain area of the district, and we have some of those, you might need proof of residency of the business owner, which would also mean that you would need proof of ownership that that person or people own that business. Sometimes there are legal attestations, so you have to make a promise that something is true and it needs to be true. There may be requests for information about your employees or the number of employees you have. And this wouldn't be for business development grants, but you might have a tax status requirement for nonprofits. And if you see that on a grant, it's always good to go back and check whether or not the grant is also eligible to for-profits. If you are a for-profit and this tax status is requested, you probably wouldn't be filling that piece out, and so you could just double check. So that was 2 whole slides filled with bullets of things that you need or might need. So it is a lot. But as we go to that next slide, one of the things that is important to remember, particularly about the basics, is these are a lot of things that you should probably have for your business anyway. And so one of the ways to think about filing for grants when you're doing this is that a lot of this paperwork, it can help you get caught up on the things that you're supposed to have, when you are getting through the eligibility pieces. So we can go to that next slide. And again, we apologize. I know there's a little bit of a delay on my side. So one of the most important things before we talk about any one of those individual documents that you might need is a principle across all of those documents. So all of the records need to align. And when I say align, it means the name of the business and the address of the business have to be the same. And this can be hard. You've registered in a lot of different systems. Different people have helped you register or typed in information. And sometimes you have a trade name. And if that information isn't clear, if the information doesn't align, then your paperwork may not be accepted. And that can be really hard on some things where, if your name was written down wrong, they may be willing to correct it for you if you go back to whoever you work with, or you may have to pay a new fee for that. But record alignment is necessary. That way government knows that your business is who you say you are. The application was not mistakenly identified or fraudulently identified, because this is a legal process, but it's also really, really important at the payment stage to make sure that the grant payment goes to the right place. If you get a grant, you want to make sure that you get that money and somebody else doesn't. You can go to the next slide. So there are a couple of different ways to think about requirements. Some requirements are across all agencies, and some requirements are only for a specific agency or a specific grant, depending on what it's doing. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those that are required across all agencies and make just a couple of notes about those that are only sometimes there. We'll go to the next slide. The other thing is to think about is the timeline. there are sort of two main times in a grant process that you might have to submit information. So one of those times, and the one that most people would see, is at the application. When you're submitting an application, you usually need to submit a lot of information to mention that you're eligible, and then the actual competitive information that you're going to submit to say, this is what I would do with this grant. There's another time that agencies may request information, and we do this sometimes as well, depending on what the request is. There may be a contingency if you are awarded a grant before you sign the grant. And a contingency is something that is legally required by the grant, but wasn't required at the application. It should still be notified to you in the RFA that that's going to be required. But that way you know that you don't have to get that until and unless you're awarded. And that can be really important on things like insurance. I think we're moving to the next slide. So we're going to focus, as we said, that there's a lot of stuff that you could look at. We're going to focus on the ones that we mentioned first in that first slide. And we're going to focus on some of the areas where we know that people struggle more often to be able to help provide some clarification on some of the different pieces you might need for grants. And I'll also say at this moment, we're going through this really quickly. If you have questions about these, please be dropping them in the chat. And please also feel free to reach out to us at any time, either asking a question so that you better understand what one of these pieces are, or if you're having troubles getting something fixed, we have a number of places we can refer you to support you if you need to make corrections in some of these basic documents. So I'm going to talk first about the employee identification number. And this is a 9-digit number that is issued by the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, to your business. And most businesses should have these. You may not have this if you are a sole proprietor, but the EIN, and we'll talk about it being free to get, is a unique identifier for your business. And so the likelihood is you might already have an EIN, particularly if you have registered your business, and it is good to know that number and to know where that number is. And one of the reasons the EIN is required, and people don't always know this, but grants are taxable income, particularly if you are a for-profit business. From time to time, grants can be exempted from taxation by a specific law. If you participated in the micro grant program from district government during the pandemic, that one was specifically exempted from local taxes, but the district does not have the power to exempt you from federal taxes. So grants are both taxable at the local and the federal level. And so for that reason, we do need to have the EIN. You may have to fill out something called the W-9 later so that it's reported, but you should know that your grant income is taxable. You should work with your tax consultant or whomever you're working with on tax to figure out what that tax treatment is. But as you are thinking about that grant money in, you should recognize that it will have an impact on the overall taxes that you pay for your business. Go to that next level slide. So there are some common confusions with that, and I think because the EIN is a federal number, a lot of people are not as familiar with the DC Office of Tax and Revenue. You're probably familiar with the IRS. That is the federal tax agency, but the District of Columbia has basically a mini IRS. It's the DC Office of Tax and Revenue. And you have to register your EIN with the DC Office of Tax and Revenue, or OTR. You most likely have done that when you register your business, but if you haven't, you'll need to make sure you go back and do that. So as we mentioned, if you're a sole proprietor and you haven't created a corporation or LLC, outside of the grant space, you can typically operate your business without an EIN. An EIN becomes required if you incorporate or if you have employees. However, as a sole proprietor, you can still choose to get an EIN, and we highly recommend it because it will protect your Social Security number. You don't have to put your Social Security number out as many places. And on some grants, and some of the grants that we do at DSLBD, we actually require an EIN because we do not want to be collecting Social Security numbers. So if we can go to that next slide. So this, I just want to say this very, very loudly. The EIN is free. There's a reason that I'm saying this very loudly, which is we have met a lot of people who have paid people a lot of money, and those other people went and got them a free EIN. You do not need to pay anyone to get an EIN. And so, I think it's important to know that. We're going to show you on this next slide and go there where you can get that. So you can get it directly from irs.gov. You'll get a copy of this slide deck afterwards. It'll have this very specific link that you can go to. If you try to look up EIN on Google, you're going to get 4 or 5 links that are, again, going to try to sell to you their services for going and getting this number for you. But you can do this directly from IRS. If you do this online, it can be available immediately. So we just want to make sure that you know that. And so we can go to the next slide. So once again, it's just you do not need to pay anyone for an EIN. All right, we can go to the next slide. So we're going to switch to a different something that you might need for grants, and it's very likely that you will need an active business license. This is typically required for all business grants and for all grants for district government. There may be some grants that are available that are not available to businesses, that may be available to individuals. I think that those are much more rare. But a business license is the document that allows you to operate your business of your type at a specific location in DC. And if you have multiple locations for a business, you need different business licenses at each location. And so you can go to the next slide. So many DC agencies do not have authority to make grants to businesses that are not appropriately licensed per DC code. So if you are licensed in another city or state, if you you probably cannot get a grant until you have licensed here in DC. And then if you are operating in a different state, you want to make sure that you're operating here and really look at those eligibility requirements. So we're going to cover this, that most of the licenses are at DCRA, but some of them may be in some other places, and we'll talk about that. But a really common confusion is that a lot of people will corporately register their business. They'll create an LLC or get a C corporation, and they won't realize that that's different from licensing. Those are 2 different functions. Both of them happen at DCRA, which adds to the confusion. But a corporation is creating the legal entity for your business so that it exists separate from your own legal self. And then the license is the local approval to say that you can operate the business. So they're different, and they both have costs. Usually, if you're going to get an LLC, that LLC should come first, because that is what will hold the license. Go to the next one. So alternative licensure. So I mentioned that most of the licenses exist at DCRA. For most businesses, you are going to get a general business license or a basic business license from the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs Licensing Division. But some professional licenses, some medical licenses, some legal licenses, and childcare centers may go through a different agency or a different process. And so if you have one of these alternative licenses or something that we weren't aware of that we didn't list that says you don't have to have a basic business license, make sure that you always have a physical copy of that license and that you have one in PDF, and make sure that it is active. That should be able to be used in place of a basic business license on your grant, but you need to make sure that you have a copy of it and that it has all the information and is readable. You can go to the next slide. So when you submit for a grant with your active business license, you might have to have a copy. So it's good to have that copy on hand. Sometimes, and we try to do this at DSLBD, we might be able to just get the license number. And then you want to make sure that you're really looking at, where is the license number? Is it the right number? Is it coming off of that active business license? And it's really important to make sure that you check the expiration date. It can be easy to miss those dates because there are a lot of different dates that are happening on different places that you've registered for your business. And one thing that comes up for folks sometimes, if your license is going to expire during the grant application period, or during the period right after, make sure you ask the granting agency what to do. You may not be able to get a new license in time to get it into your application, but you're going to want to inform the agency that you are renewing, and ask how you provide that renewed one. And as Caroline just put in the chat, make sure that you use all of the numbers in that license if we're asking for a number. You can also look up your DCRA license at any time on your own to make sure you know what the dates are and that it is active. So they have a system that anyone can log into and can use to check that status. We can go to the next slide. It's a system called Scout. And there's a lot of information that you can find in Scout, and you can be looking up other you'd be looking up other information if you need to know it. So this is where you would first go, and you'd have to, again, create a login, but then it allows you access to a lot of information that DCRA has on public record, as well as your own public records. We can go to the next slide. Once you've logged into Scout, there are a number of different ways to search information. You can search by business name. You can search by a person's name if it's associated. It's not always on the license. You can look up a permit or license number. You can also look things up by address. And so those are different things that you can put into the system. And when you do then search, you'll see that here I searched Starbucks. You'll have a bunch of things across the top that you can check in different systems. The one that you're looking for is circled there. It's called licenses. So you would have searched the business or person name or whatever identifier you wanted to search on. You would click licenses, and then what populates below, you could see the license status. And it will have old license statuses as well as new ones for that. And so you want to look through and make sure that there's at least one that's active. And you can also show details, which we're not going to show you here now, and it will give you more information about when that expiration is coming up. We can go to the next slide. If you need to update your business license, you can go to DCRA to do that. You can also do that online at business.dc.gov. If you're just getting started and don't have one, you can use the wizard through Start a Business. If you need to update, you can use My DC Business Center. So that's one place to get started and trying to update or get your new license. We can also go to the next slide. But if you are having difficulties with any aspect of getting your license, because getting the license is going to mean 4 or 5 other steps before you get the license, and it can be confusing, and sometimes folks need help on it, and that's very reasonable. There's an entire center at the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs to help small businesses. It's called the Small Business Resource Center, or SBRC, and they can help you through all of these different processes. They can help explain them. They can meet with you one-on-one, or you can call them and they can get you quick answers. So if you want to go to the next slide. If you're having troubles finding the SBRC, you can always write to us and we'll refer you to this page. But this is the page where you can get that main number. If you want to sign up for a one-on-one, they have other trainings here as well. If you call the lady whose name is here, Tamika Wood, we refer hundreds of people to Tamika every year. She is wonderful, and she'll help you get set up with working with the SBRC. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, we're going to talk about one of the hardest pieces of eligibility for businesses. When we run grants, we have to first look at eligibility and only score the applications that are deemed eligible. And clean hands is one of the most common reasons that someone does not make eligibility. And clean hands can be confusing to understand. Clean hands is a status with the Office of Tax and Revenue. DC is sort of that mini IRS that's here in DC. And clean hands is a law in district government. And so agencies cannot make grants to individuals or businesses who owe DC any money. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between you owing DC money and your business owing DC money, but there are 2 different registrations. But fundamentally, you cannot get a grant from district government if you owe money to district government. And I'm going to pause on that for a moment. Most of the time with business grants, that's gonna mean they're gonna check against your FEIN and see if your business owes any money. If for some reason you squeaked through and somebody missed your clean hands check and you came through, the other thing that can happen is the money that goes to you usually gets paid from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. If you do not have clean hands, that payment will get flagged because they're the ones making the payment, and they may hold or take your payment. And so, it is important to have clean hands because there's more than one check. There's a check at the agency level, and then there is also a check at the OCFO level. And this money could be, we go to the next slide, but this money could be that you owe taxes as your business. It could be that you didn't file your taxes even though you didn't owe anything. OTR doesn't know that. It could be unemployment insurance. It could be fees and fines that you owe for not having updated your license or your corporate registration. So clean hands, there's a database, and it is all of the information attached to your business record across government of where you might owe fines and fees. And it's one of the reasons this is really confusing is that clean hands is sort of nomenclature. sort of describing what it means to be in good standing. Good standing is, again, just a status, and you can be in good standing with many different types of entities. And so Clean Hands is often confused by people with DCRA Corporation's Certificate of Good Standing. But the way in which it's discussed and usually referenced, Clean Hands is a certificate and process that comes from the DC Office of Tax and Revenue. The Certificate of Good Standing is a DCRA Corporation's document. You may end up needing both documents, but they are not the same document. So if you are at all confused when you are looking at this, and you may talk to someone in district government and they may also be confused, because sometimes people get these confused everywhere because the language is fairly similar and what it's saying is fairly similar. But OTR Clean Hands, there is a process. We're going to show you what that form looks like. OTR Clean Hands is free to get if you are in compliance. If you are not in compliance, they will tell you. The Certificate of Good Standing from DCRA is not free to get. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that really matters for this, because it's a status, is timing. So if you got a Clean Hands certificate 2 years ago, that won't matter for your grant. It is a status that expires because maybe you didn't owe anything 2 years ago, but you owe something now. So you really need to be looking at the dates that are on the Clean Hands document and the dates that are required by the grant. So we can go to the next slide. One of the things that is often very challenging for folks with Clean Hands is that entire process of, when did it expire? And, from time to time, something new will come up. And so you need to be checking this often. If the grant period is open for a long period of time, they may accept a Clean Hands certificate under those dates, but you may have a Clean Hands issue that arises during the application period. We can go to the next slide. So the other thing to remember, a common confusion, we talked about you being able to have Clean Hands with your Social Security number and being able to check on that. And that's different than your business having Clean Hands. And particularly if you're a sole proprietor, this can be very confusing. It might actually come back, if you haven't registered an EIN, that it's going to come back and look at all of your personal taxes. So let's talk about that for a moment. If I'm a corporation, an LLC or otherwise, I am registered with the Office of Tax and Revenue under my EIN. When I'm requested on a grant to give a Clean Hands document, I'm going to check on that EIN and I'm going to submit that, and it's not going to touch my Social Security number. But if I do not have an EIN and I'm a sole proprietor, it's going to look at everything I might personally owe, and so it's going to merge those two together. So it's another good reason to consider getting an EIN and making sure that when you submit a Clean Hands document, that you check to make sure that you're submitting the one that is associated with that business and that business address. You can check the Clean Hands at any time. It is a free process, and so it's actually it's useful to do because sometimes you don't realize that there is a fine or fee that you owe. Sometimes you don't, or perhaps you don't owe it and it's an error in the system and you need to follow up with that agency. This is what a valid Clean Hands certificate looks like. So it's a form, and there's a lot of document control on this form, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. This is just a copy. If you had looked to get a Clean Hands certificate and you did owe something, you would get a similar but different certificate, and it would inform you which agencies you need to contact in order to resolve a debt, and that information would be listed there. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a little bit of that information across the top so that you can see it. So there'll be a notice date. That's going to be very important for making sure that you are having the right status time that is required by the grant. It's going to give your business name and main address. And so one of the things that can be difficult, and we found during the pandemic, a lot of people had changed their address with OTR in order to receive mail at their home. But depending on how the grant process is working, they may be looking to verify your business address. And so that is something that you'll need to make sure that you do have a clear understanding from the grant making agency, how they're going to be looking at that address. You'll see it says FEIN. It won't show the full number. It'll only show the last 4 digits. and that will show a case ID. And that FEIN and case ID is how the agency will verify that this document is a real document. So we can go to the next page. You need to make sure that you get your Clean Hands document from the Clean Hands database. No one should sell you a Clean Hands document. That is illegal. It does not cost money to find out whether or not you owe money to district government. If anyone charges you money or offers to charge you money, you should stay away from that, and you should probably report that as well. You also should never attempt to create or change that document yourself. Again, that is illegal. And it looks like my slides have come down. I just want to check and see with Caroline if how we're doing.
Minor technical hurdle, but we'll get them back up in a moment.
So if you have questions on Clean Hands at any time, we really do encourage you to reach out to us. There are some places that you can reach out with the Office of Tax and Revenue as well, but it's not always as much information as what you're looking for from the Office of Tax and Revenue. They're often very busy dealing with a lot of different tax issues. So we're going to show you in a few minutes when the slides come back up where you can request on mytax.dc.gov to get that Clean Hands document. It's something that you want to make sure you have a really good understanding of the process. When DSLBD runs a grant, and I'll just talk about this while we wait for the slides to come back up, we actually split our grant information sessions into 2 sessions. Most agencies just run 1 session, but we run 2 sessions. And the first session is all about these documents that we're talking about now. It is the paperwork boot camp, so that you can walk through all of these and get more details, even more details than we're talking about here, about where to go to get these documents and how to get support on fixing them. And then we run a secondary information session, which is all about the competitive portions of the grant. Because what we find is grant eligibility is hard, and it can be so hard that what will happen is people will only focus on that, and then they won't focus as much on the competitive portions of the grant. So their grant won't be as competitive against those many other people who have been applying for the grant. But as Caroline's getting that slide back up, I see the next one talks a little bit about the agencies verifying the document. They will, and the other thing that happens when they verify the document is it will give a new status at the time of verification of whether or not the entity still has clean hands. So one of the things to check, particularly right after a grant closes for the next every couple of days, you can be checking in and verifying the document yourself. Anyone can verify the document. There's a system to do it. And if your status changes when you verify it, you will reach out to OTR immediately and say, hey, what's going on, and see if you can resolve that issue. Are folks able to hear? I hear one person said that they weren't able to hear. Okay. At least some folks can hear. So hopefully if you missed a portion of this, you'll be able to get the recording afterwards. And we're sorry for any technical difficulties with the WebEx. So an important concept for being able to get a clean hands document is you can only get a clean hands document if you have registered with the Office of Tax and Revenue. So if you did not register with the Office of Tax and Revenue, if you somehow missed that step and were able to get a business license, they won't be able to find anything if you didn't register. So it's typically a form at licensing called FR 500, and you register at that at mytax.dc.gov. I'm going to try to speak a little bit closer. I know I'm really close to the screen, and a little bit louder because some folks have said the sound is kind of spotty. We can go to the next slide. So as we wait for that to come back up, I do have a PDF copy of the slides that I will pull up and keep talking through a little bit. And again, thank you for bearing with us on the technical difficulties. Not sure what is happening with the internet today. We use this frequently and don't have these issues, so.
Kate, we're on
oh, it's back up, great.
DC.
Okay, so this is the mytax.dc.gov website. You should use it for a lot of things for your business. So you should have created a login and password. This is where you would have registered. You can do a lot of other great things that are helpful with taxes and your business. But within that, you'll see we've highlighted here in the bottom left of the screen where you request that clean hands document. And so we've never been able to go through the exact screens, and I can't show them to you because we do not have a login. But once you have a valid login because you are a valid business, you'll be able to go through that process and request. We have had some folks have some challenges with this before, and we've been able to offer some TA as they go through the system and tell us about it. So if you are having troubles getting that clean hands and you just need a little bit of help, definitely feel free to reach out. We'll try to see if we can get someone at OTR, and if not, we'll do what we can, maybe sharing a screen to help you navigate that site. So we can go to the next slide. All right, we're going to talk about insurance. And insurance is an interesting piece. One of the things regarding equitable grant making, which my division is very interested in, being the Innovation and Equitable Development Division, we try with our grants to make sure that there is no cost to you to apply for a grant. However, district government for grantees, those who are actually awarded a grant, does require insurance on all grants. How that insurance is set may vary by the type of grant. The amount of coverage might vary by the grant, and it might vary by the activity that's happening. But one of the things to have an awareness of is if you are awarded a grant and potentially at application, you will have to have insurance. Now, one of the things, and particularly if it is required at application, and there are some of our grants that we do require at application because we anticipate those businesses will have it anyway. We are going to request a certificate of insurance, and that is usually a one-page document. If you're not used to looking at your insurance documents very closely, you might think the policy declarations are what you need to submit. However, the certificate of insurance, and we're going to show you an example of what they typically look like on the next slide, is different from the policy declarations and has the official information about what's covered. And so if the certificate of insurance is required and you do not submit that, it is possible that your application could be deemed ineligible. So this is a standard example of what a certificate of liability insurance looks like. And it has all of these charts and boxes that's here. Now, some insurance providers do provide something that does not have all of these boxes, but at the same time, it still have to say certificate of type of insurance, and usually it's liability. And on the boxes, it's going to tell you what type of coverage, what the coverage dates are. It could be multiple different types. It could be workers' comp, it could be vehicle insurance, it could be general liability. Depending on your business, you may be carrying several different types of insurance. Depending on the grant, they may require certain types of insurance. And particularly for larger grants, they are going to require that the certificate also indemnify district government. So you may need to contact someone about updating it. So this timing on when insurance was required in your grant can be very important for you. So if it's required at application, that's very different than if it's required at the award. If it's required at application, you're going to have had to pay for that insurance up front before you can apply. If it's required at award, then you only have to buy that insurance if you are awarded. Let's go to that next slide. Obviously, that can be a very big cost difference for you as a business. And if it is required, if it's required at application, it's a question for you. Does that cost make sense to you? Now, we're going to say our recommendation is to not buy insurance just to prepare for a grant. We do recommend that all businesses carry insurance, period, but we do not recommend what kind or what type or who you should work with. But insurance is beneficial to your business, and it is beneficial to you as the owner, because depending on what you might need insurance for, whatever that liability might be, if the business can't pay for it, you as the owner may be liable for certain things that happen if you don't have business insurance. But what that coverage is up to you, and it's based on your risk tolerance and those costs. And it can be very different by business type. So one thing that we are going to recommend, although it's not required, is to have a relationship with an insurance broker. Insurance is usually purchased through a broker. You can buy some insurance directly online without speaking to anyone. It's possible that may be the decision that you make, but at least speaking to a broker, they can help you navigate costs. They can help you pick which insurance that you want to have. And if you have to add on more insurance later, say you have general liability insurance, but there are additional insurances that are required by the grant, the broker can help you navigate what it means to add on those additional insurances or to increase the amount of insurance that you coverage that you need to have. And go to the next slide. So the other thing, and you know, if the insurance is required up front and you're not carrying it, and that is a burden to you to apply, you know, if the cost or the timing is, or if the overall cost of the insurance is a burden to you, it is worth asking the granting agency if there is any room to negotiate what is required. Can you demonstrate the insurance once recorded, once awarded? You know, they may not be able to answer you. They may not be able to have any movement, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Go to the next slide. And I think what's important about asking questions is even if an agency can't make a change during the current grant that they're looking at, it is helpful for them to hear where barriers are happening, particularly if you're not going to apply because of it. It's very helpful for them to know and have that feedback so that they can be assessing, you know, how can they change their grant practices in the future? What is possible? Now, with big grants, it can be very hard for an agency to get back to you on specific questions. Every agency is going to have a different way in which they answer questions, and a lot of it is based on both their internal rules, but also the volume. Our team has a no calls policy regarding grants for two reasons. One, we want to make sure that you get consistent information, so it is always back in writing. But two, given the volume of applications that we have, we cannot fairly manage everyone being able to have a call. And so we know that we can fairly manage being able to respond by email, and that's how we do that. But every agency and every team might do that differently depending on what's going on. So again, you might not get an answer, but you might. And you're going to help inform grant making practices for the future if you raise issues. So we can go to that next slide. So one thing to just really assess, you know, if the grant application is going to require insurance up front that you do not have, how much will it cost? And is that cost worth the possibility of the grant to you? And that's only a decision that you can make. But if it's costly and then you don't get the grant, what will that mean for you? And so that's just something for you to think about as you are assessing grants. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so we are going to move much faster through these last things. We're going to move super fast. I'm just going to ask Caroline to switch the slide. So corporate certificate of good standing. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about it being different than clean hands. This is if you have an LLC or a corporation. Many grants do require that you provide a certificate of good standing that says that that your corporation is still active. There is a fee for a good standing certificate. So functionally, if you are required to provide a certificate of good standing, you functionally have to pay a fee to apply for this grant. This is why DSLBD on our micro grants for businesses does not require this. We are able to, as we need to, check the status at Corp Online, and you can check that status as well. And so if this is a burden or a barrier to you for grants, it is one of those questions that you can be asking of the agency. It might not change now, but it might be able to change in the future. You can always check the status at Corp Online. This is another DCRA system, and that same sign-in that you had for Scout will be the sign-in that you have here, and then you'll be able to check on some of those statuses of your corporation. Just remember that corporation certificate of good standing, if you do need one, is also a time-limited certificate, so make sure you're looking at that, the timing that's on that, and that's matching what's in the grant. You can go to the next slide. And we're going to switch to an entirely different document that you might need. This one can take time to get, so it's worth, if you are working in commercial space, it's worth doing some of this work ahead of time and making sure you really understand it. A commercial space will have a certificate of occupancy, and this is a zoning document. The zoning administration, which is only a piece of zoning, is at DCRA. And they are the ones who would help process any changes to or help you get copies of your certificate of occupancy. Typically, the certificate of occupancy needs to be in your name and it needs to show the allowed uses in the space. But it can take time and fees to get that updated. So you might want to be checking now, particularly if you're looking at something like Great Streets for the fall, making sure that everything aligns. If you are a home-based business, you will have an EHOP, a home occupancy permit that may be required. It's good to know where that is, but that's automatically going to be in your name and automatically specify the uses. So you shouldn't need to update that unless you move, and then you'll need to get a new license as well if you move. Make sure you know where your C of O is, and make sure to check it for the name alignment and the use alignment. You can go to the next slide. So if you do need to get a copy of your C of O, you can request that from records management at DCRA. This is the site. We're not going to take a lot more into it, but that way, you can start there if you are trying to find a copy of your current C of O for your current space. So one thing that is required for many grants, not all of them, some of our grants at DSLBD, we are not requiring this anymore, but an organizational budget, which is going to be different from the budget that you submit on how you'd use the project funds. Most grants require basic financial documents that are similar to the documents that you need for your loan. We know that this has been a barrier for many people applying for federal grants, but most often you would need to submit either a profit and loss statement or a balance sheet. Less often, but sometimes you have to have a cash flow statement. These are documents that you should have and be using as tools for your business anyway, but we know a lot of businesses don't have them. If you want to move to the next slide. And so the other thing that you may see requested or required, grants that are more typically aimed at nonprofits that you may be eligible for as a business may require audited financials. Typically, that can be waived for for-profit businesses, but they may or may not have remembered to put that into the grant document itself. So you may need to ask about this. An audited financial is incredibly expensive, and so you need to be able to ask, can I submit just regular documentation? Again, this is everything that you should have for your business. If you do not have this at this time, you may want to engage a bookkeeper or an accountant, which will not be free, or you can do this yourself and engage free technical assistance so that you can develop yours. And we have some series that you can reach out to us otherwise on talking about some of these pieces. Feel free to reach out to us. We're also going to talk about taxes and previous tax years. It is very common that you would have to submit filings for the last 3 years of taxes. Oh, I think I already mentioned this, so we can go to the next slide. So for 3 years of taxes, if your business is not that old, you should be able to say, can I submit a letter that says my business is not that old, and then only submit the years that you have on record. But that is something you may need to ask about if they did not specifically state that. So I know we covered a lot of things really, really quickly, and thank you for bearing with us with some of the technical difficulties. We didn't have time to cover everything in those first 2 slides, talking about everything you might need. So let's go back and look at the other stuff that you might need real quick in this next slide. And I will say brief words about each one of them. So for your Dun & Bradstreet number, that is a third-party system. It is also free to get, absolutely free to get, but it's probably going to be required at grant payment so that they can verify that all the information about your business is correct. Ariba is a system used by the Office of Contracts and Procurement and will only be required if DC government is processing the payment of your grant, but that registration may need to happen. Depending on your grant, and we have some of these, it may only be for resident owners of certain wards. Our dream grants are only for businesses that are owned by residents of Ward 7 and 8. And so proof of residency, which we require actually not necessarily an ID, that will be required as well, but we would require some sort of recent document like a utility bill to demonstrate the residency. You may need to prove that you own that business, because if you're going to provide proof of residency of the owner, then you have to prove that that owner is that owner. And you may have to submit attestations, which are legal promises that something is true. Do not lie on those. If someone says, please verify that this is true, it could be fraud if you are making a lie in that statement. You may have to submit information about your employees. And once again, they may ask about tax status for 501c3s, particularly if it's a grant that is available to both businesses and for-profits. You should not need that as a business. And so you'd be able to not do that. All right, we're going to switch gears. I'm going to turn it over to Caroline. I'm speaking faster now because I know we're running short on time.
Fabulous. So we are going to switch gears. As Kate said, all of these documents we've talked through won't affect your business's competition if the grant is competitive. But what we're going to talk about now is some of the competitive portions of the grant and how to read the RFA, or the request for applications, which covers both eligibility and competitive portions. Typically, the request for applications includes the link to the application, what's required in a grant narrative, the budget, and what is required around resumes and letters of support. So that's what we're going to talk through now. Usually, the RFA, again, includes the allowable use of funds. Double check that information. Eligibility, scoring, how it's going to be scored, what the selection process is going to look like, and then the legal information, how the award is going to be distributed. All of these are important to read through. Often people will open the RFA and just head straight to the application link, but read through. If the award is a reimbursement grant and you need to spend $20,000 up front before you can get the $20,000 reimbursed, think about whether that's actually possible for your business. So the application link is going to be an important thing to check long before the day you're submitting it. Make sure you look at your login information, set that up and save it. But do not skip through the RFA just for the link. So we talked about some of the legal eligibility that Kate said, an active, clean hands, good standing for your corporation, but read through to make sure you are eligible in some of the more content areas. So ownership, that you are a resident or that ownership is of residence. Operation time, some grants require businesses to be in operation for more than 3 years. Experience with a given subject area. If the grant requires grantees to have certain number of years working in a given area. See whether or not you can subgrant to other entities or be subgranted to. You might be applying for a grant in partnership with a nonprofit. If nonprofits are eligible and they can subgrant to you for your business expertise as a part of that grant operation. But make sure whether that is a partnership or a fiscal sponsorship, where a nonprofit is applying, taking a fee to administer the grant, and giving someone else the funds, which is legal. That is fiscal sponsorship, but not every grant is that possible. So if you are partnering, again, partner in the right way. For many of these business grants, nonprofit partners may or may not be eligible. But partnering with other small businesses can bring expertise that complements yours, and community partners may bring connections that you need. Again, this is not just for business development grants, which are specifically for your business to grow, but grants that may be competitive and really trying to solve and meet a community need, where a community partner might bring you those connections to the community the grant is trying to serve. And working with other small businesses can really complement what the grant is asking for. So in a grant narrative, that is what is going to distinguish which grants actually get awarded based on that narrative section. In many grants, unless it is a lottery or unless everyone is receiving funds if they are eligible, you need to make sure your grant narrative is strong and that your message is clear to someone who knows nothing about your business. Different grants have different amounts that they will look at your website or other materials, but your grant narrative, you should assume that people are seeing nothing besides your grant narrative. Excuse me. So in the grant narrative, you want to make sure that you are telling your story that meets their goals. We talked about how the fact that in non-business development grants, it is really about serving the goals of an agency that is granting. So your grant narrative is going to tell the story of your organization, your program, or your project proposal, and how it directly serves the goals of the grant. How to do that is make sure you are reading in the RFA the goals of their grant. Use the same language of the key goals or objectives. It may feel redundant to say, yes, I am serving the community in X, Y, or Z way, but that is often really important to make sure you are using exactly the language and then how your business is meeting those goals. Many in the grant narrative section ask you to quantify or be clear about the outputs and the outcomes. Many of the businesses I talk to really struggle with this because it is hard to predict the future. A grant application still is asking you to project what the impact of your work will be if everything goes right. You will be able to explain why you may not hit those objectives, the outcomes you're committing to, but you want to make sure that you are being as clear as possible about what is possible and realistic if you get this funding. So don't overpromise, but also be clear about what would be possible for you based on what you've done so far. So if they do ask you to quantify the outputs or outcomes, outputs are the deliverables of the project, the documents. We are going to submit a report at the end of what we did with this fund. Events, we're going to submit photographs of the event that we are organizing, the fashion show for my fashion brand, whatever the grant is about. Outcomes are the impact of the work you're doing. So outputs is something that you will be delivering, whether to the community or to the grantor. Outcomes are the impact of that work. Residents who benefited from my event or my business, other businesses that I'm supporting through the materials I buy, people I'm training in my business specialty. So you want to be clear about what those outputs and outcomes are. Achieving the objectives. Many grants require a project plan, what you are going to do, what's the timeline. They might ask for a timeline. If you receive these funds in July, how are you going to complete them and spend them by the end of September? So again, each part of your grant, just as Kate said, everything needs to be aligned in terms of your address. Everything also needs to be aligned in terms of your project plan, the budget, and the outcomes. Nothing should be in your budget that is not reflected and directly tied to your outcomes or what you're describing in the rest of the narrative. So many grant applications will have specific requirements of what funds can and cannot be used for. Again, this is different than your organizational budget. It is the grant budget, how you are spending the funds in the grant. And so some grant reviewers choose to read the budget first to understand how you want to use the grant. Again, makes it really important to make sure that budget is tying to your project plan. So the budget is often the other most competitive portion of the grant, and the uses need to match the allowable costs. If you are applying for certain federal grants, food is not eligible. So see if you put in that you want to use 50% of the grant for food at events, or that you want to be, you will automatically be disqualified for proposing non-allowable funds. So double check in that RFA, what are allowable costs? And show your expertise. Some grants allow you to submit resumes and letters of support. Confirm whether those pages count towards the page limits of a narrative. If you do have any partners you're including on the grant, include letters of support from every partner and resumes of key staff working on this project. Ask in advance, as far in advance as possible, and when possible, provide your supporters a draft letter that aligns with your application, so they're not speaking to a different part of your business than what you're applying the grant for. So we are very close to time, but I want to reiterate, review your application. Make sure that you are reviewing, that you've covered all of the elements, that a friend or colleague is reading it as well with a fresh set of eyes, since again, the grant reviewers won't know your business as well as you do. And go back to the RFA and look at how they are going to be scoring your grant. Make sure you hit on every element that reviewers will be scoring you on. So Kate, we do have a few slides on alternative financing. Do you want to go through those now?
Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. And for those of you, we know it's 11 o'clock, so if you need to hop off, this session is being recorded and will be shared, so you can still catch this. If you can stay with us, that's great. And please keep putting any questions you have in the chat. But we're going to do this at the end of every one of these sessions, is talk a little bit about other places to find money, as you are looking for access to capital for your business. So DSLBD has a program written that is run by our colleague Camille Nixon, called District Capitalized, and it's about all the different ways to find funding and finance for your business. And so one of the things that we always want to caution and remind people is that grants can be unreliable. They're very nice when you can get them. They can take a lot of time, but you can put a lot of time into it and may not receive that grant. One of the things for most entrepreneurs is they often use multiple strategies to get capital for their business. And they do something called stacking their capital. And that means that you're going to find capital from multiple sources, not just one source. And so, to learn more about this, you can check on our Eventbrite. You can contact us for technical assistance. We do those 30-minute calls with anyone on any topic. And the DC Kiva Hub is also a great place to learn more about some of these alternatives. We can go to the next slide. So one of the series that we run is called Money Mondays. I will actually be supporting Camille, and we will be presenting something about startup budgets this coming Monday at 3 p.m., but we're always covering different topics on Money Mondays. You can find those on our Eventbrite. You can go to the next slide. And I want to tell you just briefly about the DC Kiva Hub. So this is something that we launched in May and is being run by Camille. Kiva Hub is a loan. It is not a grant, it is a loan. It is some of the best loan terms possible. You can get a loan potentially between $1,000 to $15,000, and that loan would have zero fees and zero interest. It is a crowdsourced loan, and we would support you on learning how to do crowdfunding. We've had several businesses go through this already and have been funded. And people can support you for as little as $25 that they'll get back when you pay it back. And so it can be a great way to get into financing, and you can do this in addition to applying for grants. So we just wanted to make sure that you knew that was available. We have a lot of information sessions on that if you're interested. But I'm gonna just kind of end with a note about equitable grant making. It is definitely an interest of ours at DSLBD. But I also want to say, from working with our grant colleagues across government, equitable grant making matters to those agencies as well. Some of the things to remember is that grant processes are designed around nonprofits, and so sometimes it can be harder for businesses, and sometimes you need to remind them, if you are eligible, the things that they might need to think about to make things more accessible for businesses. So also to remember, there are always more applicants than funding. Almost always. Maybe with a very particular grant that won't happen, but because grants are competitive, you may not be awarded this year, but that doesn't mean that you didn't have a good application and you might not be awarded in future years. And you can always ask questions and raise concerns if you're seeing barriers. If you apply for a grant and you are not given that grant, you should do a follow-up conversation with that agency in whatever process they make available, so they can give you feedback on why your grant didn't make it through. It might have been eligibility. It could just be that it didn't score as high as other grants, but you want as much feedback as you can get as possible. All right, we can go to the next slide. My computer is being slow again. So this is, again, the second in a 4-part series. We really hope that you join us next week, July 21, for grant programs of note. We're going to hear from the Commission on Arts and Humanities. We're going to hear from the Great Streets manager at the Deputy Mayor's Office. Great Streets is one of the biggest grant programs for businesses. And then we're going to wrap it all up July 28th. So we hope you can continue to join us. If you can go to that next slide. And we're starting a new process. We have not previously had as many evaluations of our trainings, and we would like to do that. And so we are starting the evaluation process. We will email this to you, but the link for this is here. We would love, it's an anonymous evaluation form. We would love your feedback on this. Help us know, was this useful? What else can be useful? So we can make sure that we are best serving you. And I want to thank Caroline, for being here today. I want to thank everyone else for being here today. And I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.